There is a saying among the Vreth. Old saying, older than their star charts, older than the war academies they built on the bones of dead moons. The saying goes like this, roughly translated, because Vreth have 42 words for fear and humans have only one, so something always gets lost. When the galaxy bleeds, it is because something small has decided it is large. For 3,000 years, the Vreth said that about insects, about microorganisms that survived inside gas giants, about the occasional pest species that developed rudimentary tools and needed to be relocated before they damaged anything important. They were saying it about us by the end. They just didn't know it yet. My name is Corporal Dara Osimensa, and I was 26 years old when I watched humanity get classified as a catastrophe. I want to say that first before anything else, because the histories tend to start with the admirals and the senators, and the people who made the decisions from behind glass walls on ships the size of small cities. They start with the Covenant Assembly vote. They start with the Vrethian Declaration. They start with the famous image. You've probably seen it. The one taken by a Eulanthi war photographer that somehow survived the Battle of the Meridian Gate, the one that ended up in every archive in the galaxy. The histories start there. I don't. I start on a Tuesday. Specifically, I start on a Tuesday morning in what used to be called Western Poland, in a field that smelled like diesel fuel and wet grass, and something metallic that I later found out was plasma residue from a Vrethian scout ship that had come down 40 kilometers north of us 2 nights before. We didn't know it was plasma residue at the time. We thought someone had been burning chemicals nearby, and the wind had carried it. Sergeant Talai Breckenridge, God, I miss her. I'll miss her until I die. She said it smelled like the chemistry lab at her high school in Austin, Texas. The time Marcus Oduya put acetone and bleach in the same bin because he wasn't paying attention. We were laughing about that when the sky opened up. Not opened up like a storm. Not opened up like anything I can describe properly even now, even with 4 years of distance from it. The sky changed. The color changed. The texture of the air changed. I felt it in my teeth first, this low vibration that wasn't quite sound, and then Private Yusuf Lindqvist grabbed my arm and pointed straight up, and I looked. And I saw them. Let me tell you about the Vreth before I tell you about the battle. Let me tell you about them properly, not the way the news feeds did it later, not the cleaned-up diplomatic language of the Covenant broadcasts. Let me tell you what they actually looked like when they came down out of that sky in their ships. The Vreth were considered the premier military force in the known galaxy. The Covenant had 31 species in it by the time they made first contact with Earth, and the Vreth sat at the top of the Security Council like they'd been born there, which, culturally speaking, they sort of had. They were 8 feet tall on average. They had 4 arms, the upper set built for combat and the lower set for fine manipulation. Their exoskeletal structure was partially crystalline, actual mineral deposits in the outer dermal layer, which made conventional small arms fire about as useful as throwing pens at a tank. Their military record was, to put it simply, perfect. In 3,000 years of Covenant expansion and conflict management, the Vreth had never lost a ground engagement, not a significant one. They'd absorbed the Kural horde, pacified the Drekian border skirmishes, put down the Eulanthi uprising of the 4th expansion without losing a single field commander. They had technology so far beyond ours that, when the first human scientists got access to their weapon specifications after the war, the lead physicist, Dr. Amara Nkosi from Johannesburg, brilliant woman, she looked at the readouts for 20 minutes, put the tablet down on the table and said, very quietly, "We shouldn't have survived this." She said that. We shouldn't have survived this. And she was right, technically, by every calculation that existed, by every metric the Covenant used, by every strategic model the Vreth had run before they came to Earth, which they had run extensively, in great detail. accounting for every variable they could think of. They forgot to account for us. The Vreth called our planet a regulatory matter. I want you to hold that phrase for a second. Regulatory matter. That's the term they used in the official covenant documentation when they proposed the engagement. A regulatory matter. It means, in the context of covenant law, a situation where a developing species has begun to pose what they call systemic risk to galactic infrastructure. Which is a very long way of saying we were getting too big, too fast, too loud, and too unpredictable, and someone in a meeting somewhere decided that needed to be addressed before it became a problem. Humanity had discovered warp-capable travel 6 years earlier. Not borrowed technology, not gifted technology. We'd built it ourselves from first principles after finding a partially degraded precursor relay station in the asteroid belt near Jupiter, and spending 4 years reverse engineering the signal architecture. The Covenant had a file on us. They'd had a file on us since we started broadcasting radio waves. They'd been watching, mildly interested, the way you're mildly interested in a bird building a nest outside your window. Amusing, not relevant. Then we cracked warp. Then we cracked it again, better in 18 months. Then we started building ships. That's when someone called the meeting. I've read the Covenant transcript since then. It was declassified as part of the peace settlement, though I use that word loosely. The discussion lasted, by Vreth time measurement, the equivalent of about 40 minutes. 40 minutes to decide what to do about Earth. 40 minutes where voices were raised and votes were taken, and the Eulanthi delegate, whose name I will never stop being grateful for, Ambassador Solavarathnim, argued strenuously against intervention and was voted down 12-1. 12-1. The motion carried, the Vreth were authorized, the fleet assembled. And on a Tuesday morning in what used to be Western Poland, they came down out of the sky in ships the size of city blocks, and the air smelled like plasma and wet grass. And Sergeant Talai Breckenridge was laughing about a chemistry lab in Austin, Texas, and Private Yusuf Lindqvist grabbed my arm and pointed up. The first thing they did was broadcast. Standard Covenant procedure, apparently. Before any regulatory matter engagement, the Vreth transmit a formal declaration in the dominant communication frequencies of the target species, so that the record shows, and this is their phrase, not mine, the species was afforded the opportunity to comprehend the nature of its circumstances before the correction was administered. The translation came through every radio, every satellite receiver, every military comm system on Earth simultaneously. Some people later said they felt it more than heard it. The signal was so strong it bypassed most filtering systems and just arrived. The message was simple. I'm paraphrasing, but the official translation reads roughly. People of Earth, your species has been assessed under Covenant expansion protocols and found to represent a systemic uncertainty. This assessment is not punitive. It is administrative. You are directed to cease warp-capable development immediately, surrender all warp technology for decommissioning, and submit to Covenant supervision pending reclassification as a pre-emergence protected species. Non-compliance will result in corrective action. The Vrethian regulatory fleet stands ready to facilitate this process. Response is requested within 6 of your planetary hours. 6 hours? They gave us 6 hours. I was in a forward operating base near the Polish-German border when the message came through. Our unit, 3rd Rapid Response, mixed NATO deployment, though by that point the old national boundaries had blurred considerably since the Covenant's existence became public knowledge 3 years prior. We were part of a multinational monitoring contingent that had been placed at key locations across Earth's surface in case of exactly this kind of situation. Nobody had thought it would actually happen. No, that's not true. Some people had thought it would happen. Dr. Nkosi had written a paper about it. A general named Park Jae-woon in Seoul had built contingency plans. A retired British intelligence officer, whose name I'm not allowed to publish, had been warning anyone who would listen for 2 years. But thinking something might happen, and then watching it happen while you're standing in a field with wet boots and half a cup of cold coffee, are two very different experiences. Lieutenant Commander Vasquez, our commanding officer, small woman from Guadalajara, with the kind of calm that I now understand was hard-won through years of forcing herself to be calm, she listened to the message twice. On the second pass, she turned off the receiver. She looked at the 12 of us standing around the communication unit in that field. She said, "Okay. Just that. Okay. And then, so here's what's going to happen. We're going to do our jobs. Somebody in a building somewhere is figuring out the response. Until they tell us otherwise, we hold our position, we maintain contact, and we keep our heads." Private Yusuf Lindqvist, Finnish Somalian, 22 years old, best card player I've ever met, he raised his hand and said, "Permission to ask a stupid question, ma'am." Vasquez said, "You've never asked a stupid question in your life, Lindqvist. What if the response is no?" Vasquez didn't answer immediately. She looked up at the sky, where the ships were still visible even in the late morning light, massive shapes like holes in the atmosphere, not quite fitting the world correctly. "Then we deal with it," she said. "We deal with it." God, I love that woman. The response was no. I don't mean that dramatically. The actual diplomatic response, delivered by the Emergency Planetary Council, which had been assembled with remarkable speed by standards of international cooperation, a fact that says something about what fear does to bureaucracy, was measured and formal and carefully worded. But at its core, after all the diplomatic language was stripped away, the answer was no. No, we would not surrender our warp technology. No, we would not submit to reclassification. No, we did not accept the framing of our development as a systemic risk. And this is the part that I've thought about many times since, the part I think mattered most, the part that nobody seems to mention when they tell this story. They attached a counter-proposal. Humanity's representatives sat down in a room in 6 hours, while a fleet of ships the size of mountains hung in the sky, and they attached a counter-proposal. They asked to join the covenant. Not as a protected species, not under supervision, as a member. Full voting rights, equal standing, partnership. The Vreth commander, fleet designate Koros Velamrath, whose name I've now said 100 times in testimony and depositions. He received this counter-proposal, according to the records, and paused for 11 seconds before responding. In Vreth communication protocol, an 11-second pause from a fleet commander is the equivalent of speechlessness. He eventually said, again, I'm paraphrasing from the translated transcript, something to the effect that the proposal was not within the parameters of a regulatory matter engagement, and that humanity's representatives were welcome to formally petition the Covenant Assembly after the correction had been administered, at which point, depending on the outcome of the assessment, certain limited observer statuses might be considered. After the correction had been administered. That's what he said. Our representatives said thank you and ended the call. And somewhere in a room I'll never see, someone gave an order. They came down in the early afternoon. Not all of them, not even close to all of them. The landing forces were, we learned later, a fraction of the fleet. The Vreth operated on the assumption that it would take approximately 1% of their deployed capacity to complete the engagement on a planet with our level of technology. 1%. They brought the rest as administrative backup, for the decommissioning teams, for the documentation units, for the Covenant observers who would officially record the moment Earth was reclassified. 1% of a Vrethian regulatory fleet is still an almost unimaginable military force. They came down in organized columns through the atmosphere, their dropships configured in the interlocking hexagonal formation that was, apparently, their standard planetary engagement approach. Perfect formation, perfect angles. Every ship maintaining exact distance from every other ship. Aesthetically, honestly, it was extraordinary. There's that famous video taken by a teenager in Krakow on her phone, posted before the communications went dark, that shows the dropships coming through the clouds, and even now, watching it, I feel the contradiction, this thing that was coming to end something, and it was beautiful. The landing zones they chose were coordinated, simultaneous deployment across 7 continents, not targeting population centers directly. The Vreth weren't interested in unnecessary casualties. Their engagement protocols were actually quite specific about minimizing collateral damage during the initial phase. They were targeting infrastructure, power grids, communication hubs, transportation networks. The idea was to, and this is their language again, reduce the target species' coordination capacity in advance of the pacification phase. Reduce our coordination capacity. They wanted to make it so we couldn't talk to each other. They didn't fully understand what happens to humans when you do that. Our base lost external comms at 14:32 on a Tuesday afternoon. I know the exact time because I was looking at my watch when the satellite receiver cut out. Old habit, I'd been a runner in school, I timed things instinctively. 14:32. The screen went dead, the radio went to static, and Lieutenant Commander Vasquez's handheld tactical display scrambled and then went dark. We looked at each other. Vasquez said quietly, "They just took down the grid." Not a question, statement. Sergeant Talai Breckenridge, 6 feet of measured, deliberate Texan calm, was already moving to the equipment locker, pulling out the hardened analog backup kits. The ones nobody used anymore because they were from a previous era. The ones she'd been quietly maintaining every single week without being asked, because that's what Talai Breckenridge did. She maintained the things nobody thought they'd need. "Radios are up," she said 2 minutes later. "Analog range is short, but we've got it." And just like that, 2 minutes, no panic, no lengthy discussion, we had comms. Because here's the thing about taking down a modern communication grid. It's effective against enemies who rely entirely on that grid. Against enemies who have standardized completely, who have optimized and streamlined and digitized every single process until the whole system depends on the digital infrastructure holding. We had standardized, we had digitized, we'd done all of that. But we'd been doing it for 80 years, not 800, which meant there were people alive, plenty of them, who remembered what came before, who'd trained on the older systems, who'd kept the older systems in basements and equipment lockers and training facilities because might be useful someday is a deeply human instinct. The Vreth had achieved perfect technological integration 3,000 years ago. They had no institutional memory of workarounds because they'd never needed workarounds. When their technology worked, nothing could stop it. When it didn't, well, we'll get there. Contact came from what we were calling Sector 7, an ad hoc designator that Vasquez had assigned to the region 20 kilometers northeast of us, near the tree line, at approximately 15:10. Analog radio, different unit, 12th Mountain, they said, though by that point the unit was a mixed bag of NATO personnel who'd been folded together over the previous 2 days. Their commanding officer was a tall Norwegian major named Eriksson, whose call sign was, for reasons nobody could explain to me and I eventually stopped asking about, Paperweight. Paperweight's message was short. 3 Vreth ground units moving south-southwest, estimated 200 plus combatants, possible armor. We're pulling back to the ridge. If you've got anything left to eat, now's the time. Black humor. That particular frequency of it, the eat now because later is uncertain variety, is something I've noticed is universal across military units in bad situations, regardless of nationality or training background. Something about it helps. I don't know why, doesn't matter. Vasquez took the handset and said, "Copy, paperweight, we're holding at the farm complex. Can you route east?" Long pause. "We can route east if someone's taking bets on what's waiting at the eastern end." "We'll hold the eastern end." Another pause. "Copy that, ETA 40 minutes. Vasquez, you know what we're dealing with, right? Crystal plate armor, upper limb configurations, probably level 3 phase weapons." "I've read the briefings, Erickson. The briefings say our conventional rounds don't penetrate the armor plating." "The briefings also said they wouldn't come today," Vasquez said. "I've stopped treating the briefings as definitive." Erickson laughed. It was a short laugh, compressed, the kind of laugh that happens when something is too absurd to process any other way. "Copy, 40 minutes, don't get dead." "Working on it." Here is what I knew about fighting Vreth soldiers as a 15-10 that Tuesday afternoon. Almost nothing useful. I knew the briefings. I knew the armor was crystalline mineral, partially grown rather than manufactured, which made it irregular in ways that could theoretically be exploited if you knew exactly where to look. I knew the phase weapons operated on a directed energy principle that was devastating against most materials, but required a targeting lock that, according to reports from the early engagements in South America and Central Asia, took approximately 1.2 seconds to acquire. I knew the Vreth had 4 arms and were faster than they looked, given their mass. I knew they hadn't lost a ground engagement in 3,000 years. I knew we were 12 people and they were, by Paperweight's estimate, 200. I knew a farm field in western Poland and a ridge line to the northeast and a tree line to the west, and Sergeant Breckenridge's voice behind me saying calmly, "Corporal, I need you to help me with something," in the tone she used when the something was important and the time was short. She was moving equipment, setting things up, not weapons, not yet, tools, angle measurement tools, old rangefinders, a length of wire. "What are we doing?" I asked. "We're thinking," she said, and she said it with the same tone she probably would have used for "we're having lunch" or "we're cleaning our weapons." Calm, precise. Like thinking was just a thing you did, a physical action, a tool you picked up and used when the situation required it. "About what?" "About angles," she said. "Okay." "See, the thing about a target with irregular armor," she said, stringing the wire between 2 fence posts, measuring something, "is that the irregularity isn't random, it's structural. The mineral deposits follow the growth lines. So the gaps follow the growth lines too." "Right," she looked at me. "You paid attention in the briefings." "I pay attention to everything." "Good, then help me figure out where they walk." I won't describe the whole preparation, partly because some of it is still classified, genuinely classified, not the polite fiction kind, and partly because describing it in detail misses the point. The point is not the specific technical solutions Sergeant Breckenridge and Lieutenant Commander Vasquez and the rest of us arrived at in those 40 minutes before the Vreth arrived. The point is the shape of what happened. 12 people. 40 minutes. A farm complex in western Poland. And we thought. We argued not loudly, not with anger, but with the particular focused intensity of people who are trying to solve a problem that matters. Private Kenji Watanabe, who'd been a civil engineer before joining up, had ideas about the structural layout of the buildings. Corporal Fatima al-Rashidi, who'd grown up near Mosul and had, she said once, spent my childhood playing in ruins and figuring out sight lines, had ideas about cover and concealment. Private Lindqvist, who I mentioned was a card player, had ideas about probability and positioning, where, given the Vreth formation patterns we'd seen in the briefings, they were most likely to push first, and where, therefore, we did not want to be. And Vasquez stood in the middle of all of it, listening, occasionally asking a question, occasionally making a decision, and then moving to the next decision and the next. She didn't panic. She didn't perform calm, either. I've seen officers perform calm. It looks different. It has a quality of effort to it. Vasquez's calm was architectural. It was just the shape of how she moved through a problem. Paperweight's unit arrived 37 minutes later. 16 people, tired, one walking wounded, a private named Horvath, who had a gash on his leg from something and was moving fine but had wrapped it with whatever came to hand, which appeared to be someone's spare sock. Vasquez briefed them in 4 minutes. Erickson listened, asked 3 questions, said good, and started positioning his people. That was the whole command meeting. 4 minutes, 3 questions, good. The Vreth arrived at 15:58. They came through the tree line in textbook formation. I say textbook, meaning their textbook, which was 3,000 years of refinement, perfectly organized, perfectly spaced, advanced scouts followed by main body followed by support elements, each element in the prescribed position relative to the others. I was in the barn loft. Old stone barn, smell of diesel and old straw and something organic that I decided not to think about. Lying on my stomach next to Corporal Al-Rashidi, watching through a gap in the boards where the wood had warped. They were enormous. I knew that from the briefings, seeing it was different. 8 feet tall minimum, some taller. The crystalline armor caught the afternoon light and fractured it into small prismatic glints, so that moving toward us across the field they looked, in a way that was both beautiful and terrible, like something between a military column and a slow-moving aurora. The sound they made was not what I expected. They were quieter than I expected for their size, with a low harmonious clicking from the crystal plates shifting against each other. A sound like, I keep coming back to this comparison, it's the only one that works, like someone slowly cracking knuckles, multiplied by 200. I looked at Al-Rashidi. She looked at me. Neither of us said anything. Below and to the left, invisible from our position but there, I knew Vasquez was at her own position, watching, counting, waiting for the right moment. The Vreth advance scouts reached the edge of the farm's outer boundary. They paused, the lead element raising one of its upper hands in the gesture that meant something in Vreth body language that we didn't have an exact translation for, but that was functionally equivalent to hold. And then something happened that I wasn't expecting. They stopped. Not tactically, not as a pause in an advance. They stopped in the way that beings stop when they're reassessing something, when the data in front of them doesn't match the data they were given. The lead scout's head turned, that slow, crystal plate clicking turn, and it looked at the farm complex, and then it looked at the positions on the ridge line to the northeast, and then it looked at the tree line on the west side of the property. And I had the sudden, strange, unsettling impression that it was thinking. Of course it was thinking. They weren't machines. They were soldiers, trained soldiers, 3,000-year institutional knowledge, genuinely formidable. I don't want to make them seem like automatons. They weren't. They were enemies who were, by any metric, superior to us in every conventional measurement. But they had a model of how this engagement would go. And something wasn't matching. The pause lasted, I'd guess, a minute and a half. Then Vasquez made a decision. She broke cover. Not dramatically, not heroically. She just stood up from behind the low wall on the eastern side of the complex, and she walked out into the open ground between the barn and the tree line, and she stood there in the afternoon light with her hands at her sides, in full view of 200 Vreth soldiers. I think I stopped breathing for a few seconds. Later, she told me that she decided in that pause that if they were going to come at us, she wanted to pick the terms of the opening. She'd noticed that the advanced scouts were using their targeting locks, the 1.2-second acquisition process, and she calculated that if she could get them focused on her as a clear visible target, it would pull attention from the other positions. That's the explanation. I believe the explanation. I also think she just decided that if it was going to happen, She was going to be standing up for it. The lead Vreth scout looked at her. She looked back at it. The translator unit she was carrying, a Covenant standard device, one of 12 that had been distributed to ground units during the frantic 18 months between first contact going public and this moment, crackled. The scout said something. The translator gave it in flat, affectless English. "You are the command unit." Vasquez said, "Yes." "You have how many combatants?" She didn't hesitate. "Enough." The scout's upper pair of arms shifted. The clicking of the crystal plates changed pitch. "Your technology is insufficient against our armor." "We've been thinking about that," Vasquez said. And that's when the firing started. Not from Vasquez, from the positions Breckenridge had mapped. Not conventional rounds, or not only conventional rounds. Breckenridge had spent 40 minutes calculating angles, and what she'd figured out working from the briefing data about the crystalline structure, about the growth line patterns, was where the gaps were most likely to appear in a soldier in motion. The gaps that appeared when the crystal plates shifted against each other during movement. Small windows, brief, but consistent. And she'd figured out something else. The phase weapons targeting systems operated on a heat signature model. Our thermal signatures were, compared to most Vreth-encountered species, extremely variable. Human body temperatures fluctuate more than the Vreth baseline, and our equipment generates inconsistent heat signatures depending on condition and maintenance. The targeting locks were calibrated for a cleaner thermal profile than ours. 1.2 seconds. She'd set up firing positions that required the Vreth targeting systems to reacquire every time they shifted angle. We weren't fighting 200 Vreth soldiers. We were fighting the 1.2 seconds it took their targeting systems to lock. I'm not going to tell you we won that fight cleanly. We didn't. Private Lindqvist took a hit in the 3rd minute. Phase weapon, partial lock, thank God partial, because a full lock at that range is not survivable, and it blew out the wall behind him and threw him 4 meters, and he came up with a burned shoulder and a ringing in his ears, and he kept moving. Private Horvath, who'd arrived with the sock-bandaged leg, went down in the 5th minute, and Corporal Al-Rashidi dragged him behind a wall and stayed with him, providing cover with one hand and keeping pressure on his leg with the other, and the particular quality of calm in her face while she did that is something I still think about. That was it for our serious casualties in the first 12 minutes. The Vreth took heavier losses than they were prepared for. I want to be precise about this because it matters. We did not destroy 200 Vreth soldiers. We did not win in any conventional military sense. What we did, what those 12 people and then 28 people did in that farm complex in western Poland over the course of what turned out to be approximately 19 minutes, was make the engagement cost more than Fleet Designate Koros Velamrath's models had predicted. His models had predicted no cost, regulatory matter, 1% of available force, administrative engagement. We made it cost something. And that cost, that small, specific, bloody cost, went up the chain of command and landed on Fleet Designate Koros Velamrath's desk and caused him to call a 17-minute pause in the engagement. 17 minutes. In 3,000 years of Vrethian military history, there had never been a mid-engagement command pause for reassessment in a regulatory matter action. Never. We caused the first one. I didn't know any of that in the moment, obviously. In the moment, I was in a hayloft that was partially on fire. A phase weapon near miss had ignited the old dry wood on the east side, and Al-Rashidi was shouting something from below, and the smoke was making it impossible to breathe properly. And I was trying to figure out the angle on a Vreth soldier who had gotten closer than he should have been able to while we were distracted by the smoke. He was 15 meters away, moving along the base of the barn wall, using the wall as cover. Smart, adaptable. 3,000 years of institutional knowledge, and a good brain using it. I had maybe 2 seconds before he reached the corner, and had a clear line to the ground floor doorway where Vasquez was. I didn't have a clear shot. The angle was wrong. The smoke was wrong. I did the thing Breckenridge had talked about, the thing she'd been doing all afternoon. I thought about angles. The barn roof, the pitch of it, the old iron weather vane at the peak, which was heavy and solid and loose in its mounting because everything in this barn was old. I grabbed the rope attached to it. There was a rope attached to it. I don't know why, old farm thing, maybe for adjustments, maybe decoration. And I pulled. The weather vane came down. Hit the Vreth soldier on the upper shoulder, not the armor, just slightly off the armor in the gap above the crystal plates. The gap I'd been staring at since Breckenridge first explained the growth line structure, and he staggered. One step. One stagger. Which was enough for Vasquez, who had seen it from below, to move. She moved very fast. I sometimes think about that moment. Vasquez, small woman from Guadalajara, moving very fast across a burning barn floor toward an 8-foot crystalline-armored Vreth soldier who was momentarily off balance, because a rusty weather vane had hit him in the exact right place, because a sergeant from Texas had spent 40 minutes calculating angles, because a corporal from Accra had thought to pull a rope. A chain of small thoughts. That's all it was. A chain of small human thoughts pulling on each other. The 17-minute pause ended. The Vreth resumed their advance, but differently. Differently enough that even I could see it from my position. The formation had changed. The spacing had changed. The advance element was moving in a pattern I hadn't seen in the briefings. They were adapting. Of course they were adapting. 3,000 years of military intelligence. They weren't going to keep doing the same thing. They were changing their approach based on what we'd done. But here's the thing. Here's the thing that I didn't understand in the moment but understand now, after 4 years of reading the analysis and the testimony and the post-war assessments. The fact that they were adapting meant we'd already won something. Because adapting takes time. Adapting takes cognitive resources. Adapting means the situation isn't going as modeled, and when a military force of that size and that institutional history encounters a regulatory matter engagement that isn't going as modeled, the system, the hierarchy, the command structure, the reporting protocols, the whole system has to cope with that. Fleet Designate Koros Velamrath had to explain to the Covenant Assembly why his regulatory matter was taking longer than scheduled. He had to explain it in 17 minutes and then again in 40 minutes and then again at the 2-hour mark. And each explanation was, for the Vreth, a humiliation that didn't have a word in their language because there wasn't one. They'd never needed one. We were giving them a vocabulary lesson. The sun was low when the order came through. Not through our comms, through the Vreth translator, which was still broadcasting, because the Vreth were meticulous about their documentation, and even in a situation that was not going as planned, they maintained their transmissions. The order was a ceasefire. Not a surrender, not from either side. A ceasefire pending emergency session of the Covenant Assembly, requested by. And this is where things got complicated, beautiful, impossible, requested by the Eulanthi delegation, with co-sponsorship from the Drekian representative and, extraordinarily, a junior Vreth Council member named Methverath Kas, who would later become one of the most important figures in what became the post-war negotiations. The assembly was reconvening. Because of a Tuesday afternoon in a farm in western Poland. Because of 12 people and 40 minutes of thinking. Because of a weather vane. Vasquez called us together in the remains of the barn. The fire had mostly burned itself out on the east side. The evening air coming through the gaps in the boards was cold and smelled like smoke, and that faint metallic plasma residue tang that I'd been smelling for 2 days. Private Lindqvist was sitting against the wall with his burned shoulder carefully wrapped. Private Horvath's leg had been seen to properly now. Everyone was accounted for. Everyone was present. She didn't give a speech. I want to be clear about that. She didn't do arousing things. She didn't tell us we'd done something remarkable. She didn't say anything quotable. She said, ceasefires in place, unknown duration. We hold position, maintain readiness, and we eat something. There's still rations in the kit. She paused. She looked around at us. She said, "You did good work today." That was it, 4 words. You did good work today. Talai Breckenridge made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, something in between. She started opening a ration pack. Lindqvist leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. Al-Rashidi sat next to Horvath and said something to him quietly in Arabic, and he said something back and half smiled. The evening came in through the gaps in the boards, and the ceasefire held, and somewhere far above us, in a ship the size of a city, Fleet Designate Koros Velamrath was having a very difficult conversation. Before the reader proceeds to Part 2, which documents the Assembly emergency session and the events that followed, I want to note something that doesn't fit neatly into the historical summary. I've spent 30 years studying conflict history across 20 species. I have read thousands of engagement records, battle reconstructions, survivor testimonies. I am not given to sentiment. But when I came to this material, specifically, when I came to the recovered audio log of Lieutenant Commander Vasquez's comms in that barn, which was retrieved from the burned remains of the farm complex long after the war, I found myself pausing in a way I am not accustomed to pausing. There is a moment in the log, approximately 90 seconds long, that occurs just after the ceasefire notification and just before she addresses her unit. In that 90 seconds her breathing changes. That's all. Just her breathing changes. I have reviewed this log many times. I don't know what that moment was for her. Relief, fear that had been held and was briefly released, something else, I don't know. What I know is that she maintained her position and called her people together and told them they'd done good work. The galaxy has a word for what the Vreth experienced at the hands of humanity. They coined it eventually after the war. Rakthal. It translates poorly, but the closest approximation is being undone by what you underestimated. I think about that word. I think about a small woman from Guadalajara, standing in the open with her hands at her sides. Something was started in that field. Part 2 tells you where it went. Ambassador Sola Vareth Nim was 347 years old when humanity became her problem. She uses that word herself, problem, in her testimony, without apology or regret. The humans were my problem, she says, and she means it with a specific Eulanthi inflection that suggests something between affection and exasperation, the way you might describe a colleague who is brilliant and exhausting in equal measure. She'd been the junior Covenant Assembly delegate when the first vote was called, the one she lost 12-1. She'd spent the 6 hours of the deadline window writing increasingly urgent comms to delegates who weren't listening. When the ceasefire request came in, hers, co-sponsored, she said, and I'm quoting the translated testimony directly because this is too good to paraphrase. I had been arguing against this engagement for 14 months. I had provided analysis. I had provided historical precedent. I had provided what my species considers irrefutable logical frameworks, which is to say, very good arguments. Nobody listened. Then humans did what they did in a farm in Poland on a Tuesday afternoon, and Fleet Designate Koros Velamrath requested a 17-minute pause, and suddenly everyone wanted to talk. She laughs when she says that. Eulanthi laughter is a 3-beat exhalation, breath, 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 and the transcription of her testimony is punctuated with it. Everyone wanted to talk, she says again. Funny how that happens. The emergency assembly was convened aboard the Covenant flagship Continuance, which was positioned, this detail matters, in Earth's orbit. visible as a moving light in the night sky from the surface below. In cities all over the world that night, people went outside and looked up and watched the lights moving. The session began at what was locally 21:00 Central European Time and ran for 11 hours. I wasn't there. I was in a burned barn in Poland. But I've read the transcript so many times that I can reconstruct it, and what I want to do is tell you about it the way it happened, not the way it gets summarized in diplomatic histories, where the language flattens everything into procedural progression, and you lose the texture of what it actually was. What it actually was a confrontation. Not a debate, a confrontation. Fleet Designate Koros Velamrath had spent the afternoon having his assumptions taken apart in real time by a situation that wasn't supposed to be able to do that, and he walked into that assembly session carrying something he hadn't carried in his military career before. Uncertainty. The Covenant could feel it on him. These are not stupid beings, all of them Vreth, Eulanthi, Drekian, the rest. They're sophisticated, ancient cultures with deep social intelligence. They could read the body language of a fleet designate who'd paused a regulatory matter engagement for 17 minutes and then called a ceasefire. And what they were reading was not reassuring to his usual supporters and was very interesting to Ambassador Sol Averathnim. She opened. She said, and I'm going from the transcript now, translated, so some nuance is lost, she said. Colleagues, we are here because a regulatory matter engagement is not progressing as designated. I would like to propose that the reason it is not progressing as designated is not a tactical failure, but a classification failure. Silence. In an assembly of 31 species, complete silence means something. The humans were classified as a pre-emergence protected species, awaiting correction. This classification was based on their technological development level, their political maturity index, and their behavioral predictability score as assessed 14 months ago. I submit to this assembly that the behavioral predictability score was incorrect, and I submit that an incorrect predictability score is not the human's problem. It is ours. Fleet Designate Koros Velamrath spoke for 20 minutes. His argument was what you'd expect. The engagement was proceeding within acceptable variance. The anomalous resistance represented tactical adaptation rather than any fundamental misclassification. The appropriate response was to complete the mandate with additional force, and the ceasefire was a temporary measure to allow strategic recalibration. Strategic recalibration. Meaning we'll use more. Ambassador Sol Averathnim listened to all 20 minutes. Then she said, Fleet Designate, what percentage of your projected casualties have occurred? Pause. The engagement is ongoing. Projected casualties, she said, in your regulatory matter assessment. The casualty projection for a correction engagement of this classification against a species at this technological level. What was the number? Longer pause. The Covenant knew, they all knew the number. A regulatory matter correction was projected, in doctrine, to produce 0 Vreth casualties. 0. The species being corrected lacked the capability to inflict casualties on the regulatory force. That was the definition of a regulatory matter. That was why it was called an administrative action, rather than a military engagement. Koros Velamrath said quietly, our casualty projections are being revised. Yes, Sol Averathnim said, they are, and I would like the Assembly to consider what it means that they require revision. The debate that followed lasted 3 hours. I'll compress it, because the transcript is 900 pages, and most of it is procedural argument that you'd need a Covenant legal degree to parse fully. The shape of it matters more than the detail. The shape was 2 factions. One faction, led by the Vreth and their closest Covenant allies, held that the engagement had encountered unexpected tactical complications, but remained fundamentally a regulatory matter. Humanity was a pre-emergent species that had developed more quickly than anticipated but remained below the threshold of covenant membership consideration. The correction should proceed with adjusted parameters. The second faction, Solivarath Nim, the Drekian delegate, the Eulanthi bloc, and over the course of the 3 hours, several delegates who migrated from the first faction to the second, held that the tactical complications weren't complications. They were data. They were information about what humanity actually was, rather than what the initial assessment had projected. The argument came down to a single question that Solivarath Nim crystallized, about 2 hours in a way that apparently stopped the room cold. She said, "When we assessed humanity 14 months ago, we scored their behavioral predictability at 23 out of 100. 23. For context, the Drekian border clans scored 41 before their integration period. The Kural scored 37 before the absorption. 23 was the lowest predictability score in Covenant history." She paused. "We treated that score as a risk. We said, this species is unpredictable, therefore it represents systemic uncertainty, therefore it requires correction. We were right that they are unpredictable. We were wrong about what follows from that." The delegate from the Palath Collective, ancient species, reclusive, they'd said maybe a dozen words in the previous 30 assembly sessions, spoke up. "What follows from it?" the delegate asked. "I've been watching the battle data from Poland for the past 4 hours, Solivarath Nim said. 28 humans facing 240 Vreth soldiers with technology 4 generations below ours. Not one of them ran. Not one of them broke. They adapted in real time in ways that our models did not predict, using solutions that our intelligence analysts are still, as we speak, trying to reverse engineer." She looked at the room. A species that scores 23 on behavioral predictability, in human terms, means you cannot predict what they will do when they are under pressure. You cannot predict what they will do when everything is stacked against them. You cannot predict what they will reach for when they have nothing left. She let that sit. That is not a risk. That is a capability. And the galaxy does not have a classification for a species whose primary capability is the one we cannot predict. The Palath delegate spoke again. "We are saying they are dangerous." "I am saying they are extraordinary," Solivarath Nim said. "The Vreth are dangerous. The Vreth are dangerous in ways we can fully quantify: their strength, their armor, their firepower, their tactical doctrine. We can model Vreth behavior to 93% accuracy. We know what they will do. And for 3,000 years, knowing what they will do has been sufficient, because nothing else could do anything we couldn't predict." She looked directly at the Vreth delegation. "Today something could." Koros Velamrith asked for the floor. He spoke for 10 minutes. What he said, and I've read this section of the transcript many times, sitting with it, was not what I expected from a fleet designate who'd spent a career in perfect, unbroken Vreth military victory. He didn't double down on the tactical assessment. He didn't dismiss the implications. He said, roughly, "We built our doctrine over 3,000 years on the principle that the optimal military force is one with maximum predictability and maximum capability. Predictability allows coordination. Predictability prevents error. Predictability is the foundation of everything we've built." He paused. "What I watched in the engagement data from today's action is a military force with, by our doctrine, almost no predictability, no coordination in the conventional sense, no adherence to any recognizable tactical framework. Improvisation in real time under pressure without established protocol." Another pause. "And it worked." He said it simply, not with grace, not with pleasure, not with any of the emotions it must have cost him, just simply, "It worked." "I don't know what to do with that," he said. "Doctrinally, strategically, I don't have a category for it." He looked at Solivarath Nim. But perhaps that is what you've been trying to tell us. The vote, when it came, was different from the first one. It wasn't 12-1. It wasn't even close. The resolution, proposed by Sola Verathnim, seconded by the Drekian delegation, supported by 17 of the 31 species present, called for an immediate and permanent cessation of the regulatory matter engagement, the reclassification of humanity from pre-emergence protected species to emergent contact status, and the formal opening of covenant membership proceedings. 14-17, not unanimous, but not 12-1. Fleet designate Koros Velamrath abstained. Abstained rather than opposed. The Vreth cultural significance of that distinction, according to the political analysts I've spoken with, cannot be overstated. A fleet designate abstaining from a vote about an engagement under his command was unprecedented. Unprecedented in the way that a lot of things involving humans were unprecedented that week. The resolution passed at 08:12 local time, morning. The sun was just coming up over Poland. We found out in the barn. Vasquez's translator crackled the covenant frequency, which had been transmitting the assembly session in real time for the formal record, because, as I noted, the Vreth were meticulous about documentation. And then the formal notification came through in that flat, affectless translation voice. Attention forces of Earth. The Covenant Assembly, in emergency session, has passed Resolution 7741. The regulatory matter designation for species Earth-human is hereby revoked. Formal ceasefire is in effect across all planetary engagement zones. Vrethian regulatory fleet is ordered to disengage and return to holding positions. Representatives of Earth-human governance are invited to initiate contact for formal covenant membership proceedings. End transmission. Silence in the barn. Then Lindqvist said, "What does that mean, actual words?" Al-Rashidi said quietly, "It means they stopped." Stopped as in? Stopped. Lindqvist processed that. "Oh," he said. He leaned back against the wall. "Oh," he said again. There were things I wanted to do in that moment, probably things anyone would want to do. Cry maybe, call someone I loved, lie on the barn floor and stare at the burned ceiling and not move for a while. I didn't do any of those things. Vasquez had the handset out before the transmission finished, and she was already trying to raise command, trying to establish what was happening across the other engagement zones, trying to get the picture. Breckenridge was at the eastern door watching the field, and I saw the Vreth soldiers out there in the morning light beginning to pull back, not retreating, not fleeing, moving back with the same precision they'd arrived with in their crystalline columns, the light catching the mineral plates as the sun came up. I watched them go. It was very quiet. The birds came back first. That's what I remember most. That particular quality of silence, and then, gradually, birds. The regular birds, the ones that had been scared off by the noise and the energy weapons and the smell of burning. They came back into the trees at the edge of the field, small voices, unconcerned. The world was still there. That sounds simple. It sounds like an obvious thing. Of course the world was still there. But you'd be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't, how strongly you feel it in a moment like that. The world is still there. The grass is still there, and it's wet with morning dew, and it smells like grass, not like plasma and burning. The birds are back. The sun is doing what it always does. Something tried to change that, and it didn't. In the weeks and months that followed, the phrase that got used in news broadcasts, in assembly documents, in the formal histories that started being written almost immediately, was humanity's first contact with the Covenant. But that's not quite accurate, because the contact hadn't been first. It had been ongoing for years, the briefings, the file they had on us, the monitoring. What was actually happening was first recognition. First recognition. The Covenant, for the first time, recognized what they were looking at. Ambassador Sola Verathnim, who became the primary Eulanthi representative in the membership proceedings, and who I've had the extraordinary privilege of meeting twice in person, told me something during our second meeting that I think about often. She said, "Your species does something that no other species in the Covenant does, something we didn't have a classification for." I asked her what. "You fail," she said. "You fail and then you get up and you solve the problem that caused the failure. Not just solve it, you solve it differently than you would have before the failure. You incorporate the failure. You become a different problem-solving entity because of it. Every other species we've cataloged, including the Vreth, who are extraordinary by any measure, maintains its best approach and refines it. You dissolve your best approach when it doesn't work and build a different one." She looked at me. "Do you know how rare that is?" I said I didn't. "It's catastrophic," she said, "for anyone trying to model you. You are a catastrophe of unpredictability. The Vreth were right about that." She did the three-breath Eulanthi laugh. "They were just wrong about what to do with it." I went back to the farm once. 2 years after the ceasefire. It was summer, warm, the fields around the complex had been replanted, someone had bought the property and was farming it again, which struck me as deeply, quietly right. New owners, I was told, a young couple from Warsaw. They knew what had happened there. They'd been told. They were growing barley. The barn had been partially rebuilt. The east wall was new wood, bright against the old stone. There was a small marker near the eastern field boundary, placed by someone, I don't know who, with the dates and unit designations and the names. Our names: Vasquez, Breckenridge, Al-Rashidi, Lindqvist, Watanabe, Horvath, all 12, all 28. I stood there for a while. The barley was tall. There was a wind coming across the field from the west, and it moved through the barley in waves, the way grain does, this slow, visible movement of the air, and I stood next to the marker and watched it. I thought about Talai Breckenridge calculating angles with a wire and a rangefinder. I thought about Vasquez walking out into the open with her hands at her sides. I thought about Lindqvist leaning back against the wall and saying, "Oh," twice. I thought about Fleet Designate Koros Velamrath, saying it worked in that quiet, bewildered voice, and then abstaining from a vote. I thought about what Solaverath Nim had said. The catastrophe of unpredictability. Here's what I've decided, after 4 years and 2 meetings with ambassadors and 1 formal covenant hearing, and a lot of nights in various places staring at ceilings. Humanity wasn't elite because we were stronger. We weren't. The Vreth were stronger in every conventional sense. We weren't elite because of our technology. Theirs was 4 generations ahead of ours on a good day. We weren't elite because of numbers or armor or firepower or tactical doctrine, or any of the things that the galaxy uses to measure elites. We were elite, if that's even the right word, I'm not sure it is, because of the thing nobody taught us, the thing nobody gave us. The thing we developed across 10,000 years of making mistakes on a small blue planet that kept trying to kill us with famines and ice ages and floods and diseases, and each other. We learned to think faster than the situation was changing. That's it. That's the whole thing. When everything went wrong, we didn't reach for protocol. We reached for thought. When the model failed, we built a new model. When the wall disappeared, we found the angle. When the sky opened and something enormous and terrible came out of it, we stood up and we thought. Individually, collectively, in barns and emergency assembly rooms and farms and ships, a chain of small thoughts pulling on each other. That's what the Vreth didn't have a category for. That's what the Covenant called extraordinary and terrifying in the same breath. That's what caused a fleet designate to pause for 17 minutes, and an assembly to change a vote from 12 to 1, and a 347-year-old ambassador to laugh her 3-breath laugh and say, with some affection and some exasperation, "Catastrophe." The formal membership proceedings took 14 months. There were complications, there are always complications, and the terms negotiated were unprecedented in Covenant history, and there are people, some of them Vreth, who still argue about whether what happened constitutes a proper membership or an exceptional category that has no proper name. Let them argue. We're in the room, that's what matters. Last year, Fleet Designate Koros Velamrath, retired now, but still one of the most respected voices in Vreth military culture, gave a lecture at the Covenant War Academy. The lecture was titled, in Vreth, something that translates roughly as On the Danger of Complete Models. It was about the engagement on Earth. It was about the 17-minute pause. At the end of the lecture, a young Vreth cadet asked him, "If you had the engagement to do over again, what would you do differently?" Koros Velamrath was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I would have read the file differently, not the technological assessment, not the military capability index. I would have looked at the history, the long history. I would have asked, what species survives 10,000 years on a planet that is actively trying to kill it, without surrender, without cessation, continuously adapting?" He paused. "And then I would have asked, do we want that species as an enemy, or do we want it in the room?" He looked at the cadet. "We should have wanted them in the room. We just needed to be shown why." Talai Breckenridge retired from the military 18 months after the ceasefire. She lives in Austin now. She grows tomatoes in her backyard. She told me this in the only letter she sent since the retirement, which was 3 pages long and included a diagram of how she'd arranged the garden and which plants needed which soil conditions. Pure Talai. Solving the tomato problem with the same focused attention she'd brought to crystalline armor. Yusuf Lindqvist is in the Covenant Liaison Program. He's one of the human representatives embedded with the Eulanthi Diplomatic Corps, because it turns out that being unreadable and unpredictable is genuinely useful in multilateral negotiations. He sent me a message last month that said only, "They still can't figure out how I bluff. Also, the food here is interesting." He's fine. Lieutenant Commander Vasquez commands a joint Human Covenant Rapid Response Unit, the first of its kind. Half the unit is human, half is Drekian. They've been deployed twice. Both times they resolved the situation before it became a ground engagement. Both times she did the thing she always does. She thought faster than the situation was changing. I was asked at the Covenant hearing to describe what it felt like. The moment in the barn, the ceasefire transmission, the birds coming back. I tried to describe it, and then I stopped, because I realized the description wasn't quite getting at the thing, and when I noticed that, I'd rather be quiet than get it wrong. But they waited, patiently, the way the Covenant waits for humans now, with interest and a kind of careful attention, like watching something they still don't fully understand but have stopped being afraid of. Mostly. So I said, it felt like waking up. Not like winning, not like being saved. Like waking up. Like the world opening its eyes and remembering itself. The grass, the smoke, the birds, the morning. Vasquez's voice on the radio, steady and quiet. Lindqvist saying, "Oh," against the barn wall. Al-Rashidi's face in the hayloft, as the sound of the Vreth soldiers moving back across the field came through the boards. The barley, 2 years later, moving in the wind. The world still there. We weren't supposed to be standing. But we had a habit of that. A long, stubborn, catastrophically unpredictable habit of still being there when the math said we shouldn't be. The galaxy called it a catastrophe. I've started thinking it's just who we are.